While boarding the plane, the flight attendant asked, "Did you say goodbye to everyone important?" I was fumbling with my phone, trying to text my brother about picking me up from SeaTac, when the flight attendant grabbed my wrist, not gently, but with enough force to make me look up from the screen. "Did you say goodbye to everyone important?" she asked, her grip tightening when I tried to pull away. Her name tag said Patricia, and her eyes had this haunted quality that made my skin crawl. "It's just a 3-hour flight to Seattle," I said, confused and slightly annoyed. There were people backing up behind me in the jet bridge, starting to grumble about the holdup. Patricia didn't let go. Instead, she leaned in closer, and I could smell coffee and something medicinal on her breath. "That's not what I asked. Did you say goodbye? Really say it? The kind where you tell them things you've been meaning to say?" "Lady, you're hurting my arm," I said, and finally she released me, but not before pressing something into my palm, a folded piece of paper. "Seat 23F, she whispered. "Watch the man in 23F, and whatever you do, don't volunteer for anything." She plastered on a fake smile and greeted the next passenger like nothing had happened, leaving me to stumble into the plane with my heart racing. My seat was 14A, a window in economy. I shoved my carry-on into the overhead bin and sat down, unfolding the paper Patricia had given me. It was a photocopy of a news article from 1987. 7 missing after Flight 447 emergency landing. Investigators baffled. The details were sparse, but apparently 7 passengers had vanished during what the airline called severe turbulence over Montana. No bodies were ever found. "Heavy reading for a flight," said the woman settling into 14B. She was probably mid-60s, wearing a University of Washington sweatshirt. "I'm Ruth," she offered, extending her hand. I shook it, introducing myself as David, while trying to discreetly look back at row 23. A heavy-set man in a wrinkled business suit was wedging himself into seat F, already sweating despite the cold air blasting from the vents. As more passengers boarded, I noticed Patricia having intense conversations with specific people. She'd check their boarding pass, ask them something that made them look disturbed, then move on. A young woman in military fatigues got the same treatment, as did an elderly priest, a teenager with a skateboard, and several others. Each one looked shaken after talking to her. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but it wasn't the usual cheerful welcome. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. Welcome aboard Flight 447 to Seattle. We're aware of the unique conditions today. Crew, please prepare for Protocol 7. The flight attendants exchanged glances that looked like barely controlled panic. Ruth nudged me. "Protocol 7? I've been flying for 40 years and never heard of that." I was about to respond when the plane lurched forward, pushing back from the gate with unusual urgency. Through my window, I could see ground crew members stepping back quickly, some of them crossing themselves. 20 minutes after takeoff, cruising at 35,000 feet, everything seemed normal. The drink cart was making its way down the aisle, people were reading or sleeping, and I'd almost convinced myself that Patricia was just having a mental breakdown. Then the temperature dropped, not gradually, but instantly, like we'd flown into a freezer. Frost started forming on the inside of my window. The plane shuddered, not turbulence, but something else, like we'd hit an invisible wall. The lights flickered and died, emergency lighting casting everything in a sick green glow. People started screaming. The man in 23F stood up, shouting, "Not again! I won't do it again!" Patricia rushed to him, pushing him back into his seat, but he was sobbing now, repeating, "Not again," over and over. Captain Morrison's voice cut through the chaos, steady but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've entered what we call a temporal pocket. This is the 847th time Flight 447 has encountered this anomaly. We need 7 volunteers, or we all repeat this loop forever." The cabin went silent, except for the sound of the engines, which had taken on a weird harmonic that hurt my teeth. A man in first class stood up. "This is insane! You can't be serious!" But Patricia pulled out an iPad and started showing him something. Whatever was on that screen made him sink back into his seat, face white. She moved through the cabin, showing select passengers something on her screen. Each one who looked had the same reaction, horror, then resignation. "What happens if no one volunteers?" Ruth asked loudly. Patricia turned to address the whole cabin. "Then we crash, over and over. We've been through this loop 846 times. Each time, if 7 don't sacrifice themselves, we reset to take off and do it again. Everyone on board retains their memories of the previous loops after about the 20th repetition." My mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. But the man in 23F stood up again, more composed now. "I'm Marcus Henderson. I've been on this flight 17 times trying to work up the courage. I embezzled $8 million from a children's cancer charity. 3 kids died because they couldn't afford experimental treatments." He walked toward the front of the plane. The elderly priest followed. "Father Timothy O'Brien. I protected pedophile priests for 37 years, moved them to new parishes, silenced families." His voice was steady, resigned. "I've been riding this flight for 6 months, knowing eventually I'd be chosen. One by one, people started standing up, not randomly, but specific passengers, like they'd been marked somehow. The teenager with the skateboard couldn't have been more than 16. I set the fire," he said, voice cracking. "The apartment building fire in Portland. I was high, thought it would be funny to light some trash on fire. 11 people died." Ruth grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug in. "This can't be happening. This is mass hysteria or something." But I could feel it too, the wrongness in the air, the way reality seemed thin and brittle around us. The frost on my window was spreading, forming patterns that looked almost like faces. Patricia was standing by what looked like a service door, but when she opened it, instead of explosive decompression, there was just nothing. Not sky, not ground, just an absolute void that hurt to look at. The anomaly requires payment, she announced. 7 souls with sufficient weight of guilt. It's the only way to break through. A woman in a business suit stood up. Miranda Chen, I knowingly sold contaminated baby formula in Southeast Asia. Hundreds of infants got sick. Dozens died. She walked toward the void without hesitation. I've been running from this for 3 years. I'm tired of running. 4 down, 3 to go. The cabin was deathly silent, except for some quiet sobbing. I found myself mentally cataloging my own sins. The hit and run in college where I'd clipped a cyclist and drove off. The time I'd stolen money from my grandmother with dementia. The affair that destroyed my best friend's marriage. Were any of them enough? Did I want them to be? A young woman, maybe mid-20s, stood up shakily. I'm Jennifer. I was texting and driving. Hit a family of 4. The kids. The kids were twins, 3 years old. She was crying so hard she could barely walk, but she made it to the void. Their names were Emma and Ethan. I think about them every day. Patricia checked her iPad. 2 more. The anomaly is very specific about the number. She started walking down the aisle, that device in her hand seeming to pulse with a light that shouldn't exist. When she passed certain passengers, it glowed brighter. She stopped at row 31, showing the screen to a man in a doctor's coat. He stood up immediately. Dr. Paul Reeves, I've been selling organs, taking them from patients who aren't quite dead yet, saying they died on the table. 15 people over 5 years. He laughed bitterly. I bought a yacht with the money, named it Second Chance. Ironic, right? He walked to the void and stepped through without looking back. 1 more. Patricia's device was going crazy now, lighting up like a Christmas tree. She stopped at row 8, where the woman in military fatigues sat, but the soldier shook her head. I killed in war, under orders. That's not the same. Patricia moved on, her device leading her through the cabin like a dowsing rod. She stopped at my row. The device was pointed not at me, but at Ruth. Ruth's face crumbled. No, I'm a grandmother. I have grandchildren who need me. But Patricia turned the iPad toward her, and I caught a glimpse of the screen. It showed Ruth, younger, in a nurse's uniform, injecting something into an IV. Then another image, and another. Dozens of them. Ruth Morrison, Patricia said quietly. 37 counts of medical murder over 12 years. You called yourself an angel of mercy, but you just liked the power. Ruth was shaking her head, but tears were streaming down her face. They were suffering, she whispered. They wanted to go. Some of them, Patricia agreed, but not all. The device doesn't lie. It reads guilt. Actual guilt, not rationalization. Ruth looked at me, and for a moment I saw the real her. Not the grandmother in the university sweatshirt, but someone capable of playing God with other people's lives. She stood up slowly, joints creaking. Will it hurt? She asked Patricia. No, Patricia replied. It's like stepping through a door. On the other side is nothing, or everything. The reports vary. Ruth laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I always wondered what came next. Guess I'll find out. She walked to the void, paused at the threshold, then turned back to the cabin. For what it's worth, I really did think I was helping them, most of them. Then she stepped through and was gone. The moment the 7th person disappeared, the void snapped shut with a sound like thunder. The plane lurched, the lights came back on, and suddenly we were flying through clear blue sky like nothing had happened. The captain came on the intercom, his voice normal now, cheerful even. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Seattle. Weather looks perfect for landing, but we all remembered. Every passenger sat in stunned silence, processing what we'd just witnessed. 7 people had walked into nothingness to save the rest of us. Their seats sat empty, their belongings still in place. Marcus's coffee was still steaming. Ruth's crossword puzzle was half finished, her reading glasses folded on the tray table. Patricia walked down the aisle with a cart full of documents. The airline requires all passengers to sign these NDAs. Refusal will result in placement on a permanent no-fly list. You'll also receive compensation of $50,000 for your discretion. She said it like she was offering peanuts or pretzels, routine and practiced. How long has this been happening? I asked her when she reached my row. She paused, considering whether to answer. Every flight 447 since 1987. Same route, same requirement. 7 souls with sufficient guilt to pay the toll. She handed me the papers. Sign or don't sign. Either way, you can never speak of this publicly. Why warn people? Why ask about goodbyes? I pressed. She looked exhausted suddenly, every one of those 8:47 flights showing in her eyes. Because sometimes the chosen ones have young children, dying parents, people who need them despite what they've done. The goodbye question helps identify those with strong anchors to this world. Sometimes that's enough to shift the selection. I signed the papers. What else could I do? But I couldn't stop thinking about Ruth, about how normal she'd seemed. How many killers were walking around looking like grandmothers? How many of us carried enough guilt to feed an anomaly's hunger? The landing was smooth, typical Seattle drizzle greeting us as we taxied to the gate. As we filed off the plane, I passed the empty seats of the 7. Each one had been marked with a small placard. Passenger deplaned during service, like they'd just gotten off early somehow. In the terminal, men in suits were waiting to escort us to a private room. The lead attorney, a woman who introduced herself as Ms. Crawford, explained the situation with clinical detachment. What you experienced was a localized temporal anomaly that requires biological payment to traverse. Think of it as a toll booth between dimensions. The 7 who volunteered allowed the rest of you to pass through safely. Volunteered? Someone scoffed. They were coerced. Ms. Crawford shook her head. They were selected based on their guilt signatures, but the final choice was theirs. They could have refused. Then 7 others would have been selected and so on, until we had the required payment or until the plane crashed, triggering another loop. She pulled up a presentation on the wall screen, showing a map with various flight routes marked in red. Flight 447 is not unique. There are 17 known anomaly routes worldwide. Each has its own requirements. Flight 923 to Denver requires 3. Flight 666 to Vegas requires 13. We've been managing these passages for decades. Why not just stop flying these routes? A passenger asked. Ms. Crawford clicked to the next slide, showing a graph. The anomalies are growing. If we don't feed them regularly, they expand. The last time we tried to abandon a route, in 2003, the anomaly consumed the entire airport, 1,147 casualties. Now we maintain the schedule and manage the cost. She explained that passengers were selected using an algorithm that measured what they called karmic debt, actions that had caused suffering to others, weighted by intentionality and harm caused. The flight attendant's devices could read these signatures, identifying potential candidates. It's not perfect, she admitted, but it's better than random selection. What about the families of the 7? I asked. Standard aviation insurance policies, mechanical failure over mountainous terrain, bodies unrecoverable. Their families are compensated well above standard rates. She pulled out 7 files. Mr. Henderson's embezzlement victims will receive anonymous donations totaling his entire estate. Father O'Brien's victims are being contacted for settlement offers. We try to create some balance. After 3 hours of briefing and paperwork, they released us with our NDAs and our guilt money. My brother was waiting at pickup, complaining about the delay. I told him the flight was fine, just some weather. He didn't notice my hands shaking as I loaded my bag into his car. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the void, about the way reality had bent around it. I started researching, finding breadcrumbs of truth among conspiracy theories, reports of missing passengers that didn't quite add up, statistical anomalies in aviation casualties, always in groups of 7, 3, or 13, depending on the route. A week later, Patricia called me. I don't know how she got my number. You're looking into things you shouldn't, she said without preamble. I'm trying to understand, I replied. She sighed. Meet me at the Pike Place Market, noon tomorrow. Come alone. I found her at a coffee shop overlooking the Sound, looking older in civilian clothes. I've been flying that route for 12 years, she said. I've selected 1,428 people for the void. I remember every one of their names, their confessions, the look in their eyes when they realized they'd been chosen. How do you live with it? I asked. She laughed bitterly. I don't. I exist with it. I tell myself I'm saving 180 people each flight, that the 7 I choose are guilty of terrible things, but guilt is complicated, isn't it? Some of them were broken people who made horrible mistakes. Others were genuine monsters. The device doesn't distinguish. She told me about the other flight attendants who'd quit, unable to handle the selection process. Several had committed suicide. Others had disappeared, possibly taking international flights to escape, possibly selected themselves on other anomaly routes. We're marked by what we've done, she said. The devices can read it on us too. Eventually, we all pay the toll. Why tell me this? I asked. She pulled out a business card. Because you're going to be recruited. Passengers who survive Flight 447 and show curiosity rather than trauma are flagged as potential employees. The airline needs people who can handle the truth, who can make the hard choices. She stood to leave. When they call, and they will, remember that saying no is also a choice, just not one without consequences. 2 weeks later, the call came. A job offer with American Airlines, specifically for their Special Routes division. The salary was 3 times what I made as a software developer. The benefits were unbelievable. The job description was deliberately vague, talking about passenger safety assessment and route anomaly management. I turned it down. They called again, increasing the offer. I turned it down again. Then my brother called me, panicked. He'd been bumped to Flight 447 for his business trip next month. Weird thing, he said. They upgraded me to first class for free. Said I was a valued customer, but I've only flown with them twice. The message was clear. I called the airline back and accepted the position. My training took place in a facility outside Amarillo, hidden in plain sight as a corporate retreat center. There were 12 of us in the program, all survivors of various anomaly flights. We learned about the history of the rifts, the theory behind their existence, the moral frameworks used to justify the selection process. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the lead researcher, explained that the anomalies were tears in space-time caused by humanity's collective guilt. Think of it as karmic pollution, she said. The weight of unpunished crimes, unconfessed sins, unresolved guilt. It accumulates until reality itself cracks. The anomalies are both symptom and cure, demanding payment for passage while preventing larger ruptures. We learned to read the devices, which weren't actually reading guilt, but rather what they called causal shadows, the ripple effects of harmful actions on the fabric of reality. A murdered person left a void that pulled at their killer. Stolen money created an imbalance that registered as heat. The devices translated these distortions into readable data. But it's not justice, one trainee protested. We're not judges, Dr. Kane nodded. No, we're not. We're garbage collectors. We identify and remove the worst of the karmic pollution to keep the system functioning. It's ugly, necessary work. If you want justice, become a lawyer. If you want to keep planes from disappearing into temporal loops, stay here. My first assignment wasn't Flight 447 but Flight 923 to Denver, which only required 3 sacrifices. The anomaly was smaller, newer, less stable. I shadowed a veteran attendant named Michael, who'd been doing this for 8 years. The trick, he said, is to not look at them as people. Look at them as problems to be solved. This one murdered his wife. That one ran a child trafficking ring. This one poisoned a town's water supply for profit. But they were people. I could see their humanity, even through their guilt. The murderer was also a father who'd snapped after years of abuse. The trafficker had been trafficked herself as a child. The poisoner was trying to save his failing company and the hundreds of jobs it provided. The device didn't care about context, but I did. The first time I had to make a selection, my hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the device. It was pointing at a young mother traveling with her infant. The readings were off the charts. Michael took the device from me and did a deep scan. She killed her first baby, he said quietly. Postpartum psychosis. Drowned him in the bath. This one's a replacement. I watched her cooing at her infant, seeming so normal, so loving. But the device didn't lie. When I approached her with the selection notice, she didn't deny it. I knew this day would come, she said simply. I've been waiting for judgment. She kissed her baby goodbye, handed him to another passenger, and walked to the anomaly door without being asked. 3 months into the job, I started seeing patterns the devices couldn't read, connections between passengers that suggested orchestration, the same names appearing on different flights, always just below the guilt threshold for selection. I brought it to Dr. Kane, who seemed unsurprised. There's a group, she admitted. People who know about the anomalies and use them for disposal. They identify targets with high guilt signatures and manipulate them onto anomaly flights. Think of them as vigilantes using our system as an execution method. She showed me files, dozens of cases of suspected manipulation. We allow it, she continued, because they're doing us a service. They're sending us people who need to be removed anyway. The alternative is random selection, which could take doctors, teachers, parents of young children. The vigilantes ensure we get the worst of the worst. But who decides who's worst? I asked. She had no answer for that. I met one of them 6 months later, an older man named Victor, who'd lost his daughter to a drunk driver. The driver had gotten off on a technicality. Victor had spent years researching the anomalies, learning their schedules, their requirements. He'd manipulated the driver onto Flight 66, knowing the man's guilt would make him a certain selection. I've sent 37 people through various anomalies, Victor told me over coffee. All of them deserved it. All of them had escaped conventional justice. He showed me his list, names crossed off one by one. I'm not a killer, he insisted. I just ensure karma finds its targets. I should have reported him, but I didn't. Because part of me understood. Part of me was grateful that people like Ruth ended up on these flights instead of innocents. The system was horrible, but it was better than chaos. Better than letting the anomalies grow until they consumed airports, cities, maybe more. A year into the job, I was assigned to Flight 447 permanently. Patricia had finally quit, or been selected, no one would say which. I took over her role as lead attendant for anomaly management. My first flight in charge, I had to select 7 from a manifest of 187. The device made it easy, highlighting the worst offenders, but the weight of choice was crushing. Among them was a teenager who'd cyberbullied 3 classmates into suicide, a CEO who'd knowingly sold defective medical devices that killed dozens, a nurse who'd been euthanizing patients for inheritance money, a gang member who'd executed a family of witnesses, a contractor who'd used substandard materials in a school that later collapsed, a drunk driver who'd killed multiple people in separate incidents, a therapist who'd been deliberately driving patients to suicide. I made the selections, watched them walk to the void, listened to their confessions. Some went proudly, refusing to apologize. Others wept, begged, tried to bargain. One fought, had to be sedated and carried, but they all went through. The anomaly took them all. After that flight, I understood why Patricia had looked so haunted. Each selection took a piece of you. Each confession added to your own guilt burden. I was saving 180 people, but I was also sending 7 to their deaths. The math said it was worth it. My conscience wasn't convinced. I started drinking. Not enough to affect my job, but enough to sleep without dreams. Enough to forget the faces of the selected. Enough to pretend I was just a flight attendant, not an arbiter of life and death. 2 years in, I made a mistake. I let personal feelings affect a selection. There was a passenger, an old man who reminded me of my grandfather. The device marked him clearly. He'd been a guard at a concentration camp, had actively participated in executions, but he was 93, traveling to see his great-grandchildren for the first time. I skipped him, selected someone with a lower guilt reading instead. The anomaly rejected the substitution. The plane lurched, reality fractured, and suddenly, we were back at takeoff. The loop had begun. The old man remembered immediately, understood what had happened. You have to choose me, he said. I've been running from this judgment for 70 years. It took 3 loops before I could do it. 3 times taking off, reaching the anomaly, failing to pass through. Each loop, more passengers retained their memories. By the 3rd loop, everyone knew what was happening. They were looking at each other, trying to figure out who the 7 would be, some actually volunteering their own confessions to save others. Finally, I selected correctly. The old man walked to the void with dignity. I was 18, he said to the cabin. I thought I was serving my country. I was wrong. I've lived with it every day since. He stepped through, and the anomaly accepted him. That was when I realized the true horror of the system. It wasn't just about removing guilt. It was about confession, acknowledgement. The anomaly fed on admission as much as action. Those who went denying their crimes took longer to process, made the passage rougher. Those who confessed, who owned their guilt, smoothed the way. I started requiring confessions before selection, making the chosen ones state their crimes to the cabin. It was cruel, but it made the passages easier. It also served as a warning to the other passengers. Many would leave the plane and turn themselves in for lesser crimes, terrified of ending up on another anomaly flight. 3 years into the job, I met someone who changed everything. Dr. Sarah Kim, a physicist who'd been studying the anomalies from the outside. She'd lost her husband on Flight 923, one of the selected 3, but instead of anger, she'd turned to research, trying to understand what had taken him. The anomalies aren't natural, she told me over dinner. They're not tears in space-time or karmic pollution. They're harvesting operations. She showed me her research, equations I couldn't understand but patterns I could see. Something is feeding on human guilt. Not metaphorically, literally. The anomalies are mouths, and we're feeding them. What's on the other side? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I think it's a prison, she said. Or a zoo. Something is collecting humans with specific emotional signatures. Guilt is just the easiest to measure and harvest. There are probably other anomalies we haven't found yet, feeding on different emotions. The implications were staggering. We weren't managing natural phenomena. We were participating in something's feeding schedule. The airline knew. The government knew. They'd decided that sacrificing a few to save many was acceptable, but they'd never asked what we were sacrificing them to. Dr. Kim and I started working together, secretly documenting everything. She installed sensors on my device, collecting data during flights. We mapped the anomalies, tracked their growth patterns, tried to understand their purpose. What we found was terrifying. The anomalies were growing, but not randomly. They were spreading in specific directions, converging on population centers. By Dr. Kim's calculations, within 50 years, they'd merge into a single massive rift. When that happened, the selection wouldn't be 7 or 13 or 3. It would be millions. We're not preventing catastrophe, she explained. We're training for it, teaching humanity to accept selection, to walk voluntarily into the void. When the big one comes, they'll need us to choose who lives and who dies on a massive scale. I wanted to expose everything, but who would believe us? And even if they did, what was the alternative? Stop feeding the anomalies and let them grow faster? Fight back against something we didn't understand? Every option seemed worse than continuing the current system. 5 years into the job, I was promoted to Senior Anomaly Manager, overseeing all 17 known routes. I trained new attendants, refined selection protocols, managed the growing vigilante network that helped identify targets. I became what Patricia had warned me about, someone who could make the hard choices without flinching, but the guilt accumulated. Not the kind the devices could read, but a deeper, more personal burden. I'd sent over 3,000 people through various anomalies. I knew their names, their crimes, their last words. Some haunted me more than others. The young mother with postpartum psychosis, the teenager who'd made a terrible mistake, the old man who'd spent 70 years trying to atone. I started my own list, like Victor's, but in reverse. Not people to send through, but people I'd saved by sending others. Every passenger who landed safely because 7 or 3 or 13 had paid the toll. The math said I'd saved over 50,000 lives. It didn't make me feel like a hero. Dr. Kim made a breakthrough in year 6. She'd figured out how to communicate through the anomalies, not with whatever was on the other side, but with the people we'd sent through. They weren't dead, exactly. They existed in some kind of suspended state, preserved like specimens. I spoke to my husband, she told me, tears streaming down her face. He's aware. They're all aware. They experience their guilt on loop over and over. It's not death, it's eternal judgment. The discovery broke her. She quit her research, destroyed her notes, begged me to never tell anyone what we'd found, but I couldn't unknow it. Every selection after that, I knew I wasn't just sending people to death, but to endless torment. The confessions took on new meaning. They weren't just smoothing the passage. They were programming the loop the selected would experience forever. I tried to quit, but the airline wouldn't let me. I knew too much, was too valuable. They offered me more money, better benefits, threatened my family indirectly. Finally, they played their trump card. If I quit, my brother would be selected on his next flight. My guilt signature had grown heavy enough that my whole family was now vulnerable. So I continued. Flight after flight, selection after selection. I refined the process, made it more humane where possible. I started warning people, like Patricia had warned me, asking about goodbyes, giving them a chance to make peace. Small mercies in a system without mercy. 7 years in, something changed. The anomaly on Flight 447 started rejecting selections. People with clear guilt signatures would approach the void and be pushed back. The device readings became erratic. The loops became more frequent, harder to break. Something on the other side had grown full, or bored, or had developed new tastes. The airline brought in experts, specialists, who'd been studying anomalies since the beginning. They determined that this specific anomaly had evolved, now requiring not just guilt, but specific types of guilt. It wanted novelty, unique sins it hadn't tasted before. The common murders and thefts no longer satisfied it. This made selection even harder. I had to look for unusual crimes, creative cruelties, the man who'd invented a form of torture, the woman who'd created a computer virus that destroyed medical records, the teenager who'd started a cult that ended in mass suicide. The anomaly had become a connoisseur of human evil. Other routes started showing similar changes. The anomalies were learning, adapting, becoming pickier about their food. The vigilante network struggled to find appropriate targets. We started having more loops, more failed passages, The system was breaking down. Dr. Kane called an emergency meeting of all anomaly managers. We need to consider alternatives, she said. The current model is unsustainable. Someone suggested trying to close the anomalies, but we'd tried that before with catastrophic results. Another proposed increasing the number of flights, feeding them more frequently. But that would require more selections, more guilt, more everything. Finally, someone said what we were all thinking. What if we negotiated? The idea was insane, but so was everything else about our situation. If the anomalies were mouths, maybe they had minds. If they had minds, maybe they could be reasoned with. The airline approved a test run, sending a team of negotiators through Flight 66 with recording equipment and a promise to return them if possible. They came back changed. Not physically, but mentally. They'd spoken to something that called itself a collector. It had been gathering humans for millennia, feeding on their emotions, studying them. Earth was just one of many worlds it harvested from. The anomalies were its fishing lines, cast through dimensions. The collector offered a deal. Instead of random selection based on guilt, we could offer volunteers, people who wanted to escape, who were dying anyway, who had nothing left. In exchange, it would stabilize the anomalies, prevent them from growing. It might even close some of the smaller ones. The moral implications were staggering. We'd go from executing the guilty to euthanizing the desperate. But the volunteers would go willingly, without the trauma of selection. The passages would be smoother, the loops eliminated. It was a devil's bargain, but perhaps better than what we had. I was part of the team that implemented the volunteer program. We set up recruitment centers in hospices, prisons, psychiatric facilities. We looked for people who wanted to die anyway, offering them a purpose in death. Save 180 lives, we told them. Your death will mean something. The response was overwhelming. Terminally ill patients signed up in droves. Death row inmates volunteered for immediate passage. Depressed individuals saw it as a meaningful exit. We had waiting lists for every anomaly route, but something felt wrong. These weren't guilty people paying for crimes. They were vulnerable people being exploited. The anomalies accepted them but seemed unsatisfied, like eating junk food instead of a proper meal. The passages became rougher, the turbulence worse. Then volunteers started coming back. Not physically, but as voices through the communication system Dr. Kim had discovered. They weren't experiencing guilt loops like the selected had. They were experiencing something worse, the absence of meaning. They'd volunteered to save others, but without guilt to process, they just existed in emptiness, aware, but purposeless. We made a mistake, one volunteer's voice crackled through during a Flight 447 passage. This isn't salvation. It's just nothing. Forever nothing. The cabin heard it, passengers screaming, demanding to know what was happening. We couldn't hide it anymore. The program collapsed overnight. Volunteers withdrew their applications. Families of those who'd already gone through sued the airline. The media finally got hold of the story, though they only understood fragments. Conspiracy theories exploded online, some surprisingly close to the truth. We reverted to the old system, but it was too late. The anomalies had tasted willing sacrifice and found it lacking. They wanted guilt again, but more of it, deeper varieties. The selection threshold kept rising. Soon, ordinary murders wouldn't qualify. Only serial killers, genocidaires, the absolute worst of humanity met the requirements, but there weren't enough of them. Not for 17 routes running regular schedules. We started having more loops, more crashes, more failures. The anomalies were starving, and starving predators become desperate. That's when the expansion began. Flight 447's anomaly grew beyond its usual boundaries, manifesting earlier in the flight, lasting longer. Other passengers started feeling its pull, even those without significant guilt. The devices could barely contain it, direct it to appropriate targets. Sometimes it would take 8, 9, even 10 people before being satisfied. I was on the flight when it first breached containment entirely. We were somewhere over Montana, approaching the usual anomaly point, when reality just tore. Not a clean rift like usual, but a ragged wound in the air. The void wasn't confined to one door anymore. It was seeping through the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Passengers were being pulled toward different rifts, seemingly at random. The devices went haywire, unable to get readings, unable to identify selections. I watched a child get pulled toward the void while a serial killer sat untouched. The anomaly wasn't selecting anymore. It was just feeding. I grabbed the child, pushing her back to her seat, but felt the pull myself. Not physical, but something deeper, tugging at whatever part of me the devices usually read. "Everyone hold on to something," I shouted, but my voice was lost in the roar of collapsing reality. The plane itself was coming apart, not mechanically, but conceptually. Rows of seats existed and didn't exist simultaneously. Passengers flickered between being and not being. Then I heard it, not through my ears, but directly in my mind. The collector's voice, vast and alien and amused. "The contract is void," it said. "You failed to feed us properly. Now we feed ourselves." The plane shuddered. Reality snapped back, and suddenly we were landing in Seattle like nothing had happened. But something had. We'd all heard the voice. We'd all felt the pull. Every passenger on that flight was marked now, traceable by the anomalies wherever they went. Within a week, 3 passengers from that flight disappeared from their homes. No signs of struggle, just gone. A week later, 5 more. The anomalies weren't confined to planes anymore. They were hunting. The airline tried to maintain normal operations, but more routes started experiencing breaches. Flight 923 to Denver consumed an entire plane, all 147 passengers and crew gone in an instant. Flight 666 to Vegas never took off. The anomaly manifested at the gate, creating a rift that swallowed half the terminal. The government finally intervened, grounding all anomaly routes, evacuating airports near known rifts. But it was too late. The anomalies had broken free from their patterns. They appeared randomly now, in shopping malls, schools, hospitals, always hungry, always hunting. Dr. Kim came out of retirement with a desperate theory. We trained them, she said. By feeding them regularly, we taught them to expect food. Now they're foraging on their own. She proposed a solution that seemed insane. Stop all feeding immediately. Starve them until they retreated or died. But how do you starve something that exists outside normal space? How do you contain something that can appear anywhere? The military tried conventional weapons, but bullets and bombs passed through the rifts without effect. Nuclear options were discussed and thankfully dismissed. That's when Victor and his vigilante network proposed their solution. They'd been tracking high-guilt individuals globally, creating a database of potential selections. Give us resources, they said. We'll deliver them to the anomalies, enough to satisfy them, make them retreat. It was genocide disguised as justice. But what choice did we have? The government secretly funded Victor's operation, giving them access to criminal databases, surveillance networks, transportation. They became a black ops feeding program, kidnapping the guilty and throwing them to the anomalies. I wanted no part of it, but I was conscripted anyway. My experience with selection made me valuable. I helped identify targets, predict anomaly manifestations, coordinate deliveries. I became complicit in state-sanctioned murder, even if the victims were murderers themselves. The feeding program worked, to a degree. The anomalies stopped random hunting, returning to semi-predictable patterns. But they required more food now, having grown during their free feeding period. What once took 7, now took 70. What once took 3, now took 30. Cities built containment zones around permanent rifts, sacrificial areas where the guilty were sent, modern-day coliseums where people paid for their crimes by walking into oblivion. The public was told these were maximum security prisons. In a way, they were. I visit one sometimes, the containment zone built where Gate C-17 at SeaTac used to be. It's where Flight 447's anomaly finally settled, a permanent tear in reality surrounded by electric fences and guard towers. Every day, buses arrive with selections from around the country. They walk through in groups, processed like cattle, feeding the thing that once lived at 35,000 feet. Ruth would have ended up here eventually, I think. Her guilt would have drawn her like gravity. Maybe it's better she went when she did, with dignity, with purpose, saving 180 people instead of just feeding a hungry void. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself to sleep at night. Patricia finally contacted me last month. She hadn't quit or been selected. She'd found a way out somehow, living off the grid in Alaska. They're evolving again, she warned. The anomalies, they're not just feeding anymore. They're reproducing. She was right. New rifts had started appearing, small ones, in places with high emotional concentration, hospitals, funeral homes, wedding venues. They fed on different things, grief, joy, love. The collector wasn't just harvesting guilt anymore. It was harvesting the full spectrum of human experience. The government's response was predictable. More containment zones, more selection protocols, more feeding programs. But how do you select for joy? How do you measure love scientifically enough to sacrifice it? The devices could read guilt, but these new emotions required different tools, different choices. I refused to help develop those tools. I'd sent enough people through various voids. My own guilt signature had grown so heavy that devices screamed when I held them. I was one bad day away from being selected myself, and part of me welcomed it. At least then I'd know what was on the other side. Really know, not just hear echoes through communication systems. But I had work to do first. Dr. Kim and I had been developing something in secret, not a weapon, but a message. If the anomalies were mouths, and the collector had a mind, maybe it had enemies too. Maybe somewhere in the universe, something opposed it, fought it, could help us fight it. We broadcast our message through every anomaly simultaneously, using the guilt and pain and fear of thousands of selections as fuel. It was simple. We are prisoners. We need help, please. The response came 3 days later, not through the anomalies but through every radio, television, and computer on Earth simultaneously. A different voice, still alien but somehow warmer. We hear you. We have fought the collectors before. Hold on. That was 6 months ago. Since then, the anomalies have been quieter, almost cautious. They still feed, but less aggressively. Something has them spooked. The government thinks their feeding program is working, but those of us who know better can feel it. A tension in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I still fly sometimes, regular routes on normal planes, but I can feel the thin places where reality might tear. I see the guilt signatures on fellow passengers, the weight they carry. I know that if an anomaly opened right now, who would be selected? Who would be saved? It's a horrible knowledge that never leaves. My brother asked me once if I regretted taking the airline job, becoming part of the system. I told him the truth. I regret everything and nothing. Every selection haunts me, but every safe landing justifies it. I'm not a hero or a villain, just a man who learned that reality has a price and someone has to collect the toll. The war is coming. The voice that answered our distress call wasn't offering rescue, but recruitment. Earth is about to become a battlefield between cosmic forces that feed on consciousness itself. The anomalies were just the beginning, fishing lines cast by one predator. Soon, others will arrive, with their own hungers, their own methods. When that happens, the selection protocols we developed, the guilt-reading devices, the feeding programs, they'll seem quaint. We thought we were managing a crisis, but we were actually being trained for something worse. The collector wasn't just feeding on us, it was preparing us, teaching us to sacrifice, to choose who lives and dies. Because when the real war begins, those skills will be essential. Someone will have to decide who boards the evacuation ships and who stays behind. Someone will have to measure human worth against alien appetites. Someone will have to ask the question Patricia asked me all those years ago. Did you say goodbye to everyone important? Now I ask it myself every morning, because I know the truth. We're all on Flight 447 now. The whole planet is approaching an anomaly we can't see, requiring a toll we can't calculate. And when it arrives, when reality tears open completely, we'll all have to decide. Do we volunteer? Do we get selected? Or do we fight? I've made my choice. I've sent enough people through enough voids. When the moment comes, I won't be selecting others. I'll be walking forward myself, using my accumulated guilt as a weapon, feeding myself to whatever horror awaits to buy others time to escape or fight or find another way, because that's what Patricia was really trying to tell me. The question isn't about saying goodbye. It's about being ready to go yourself when the selection finally comes for you. And it always comes, eventually, for everyone. Flight 447 still flies, 3 times a week, Seattle to Chicago. The anomaly is smaller now, more manageable, only requiring 7 again. New flight attendants make the selections, use the devices, ask about goodbyes. They don't know about the war coming, about the voices through the void, about the thing that answered our call for help. But they know what I learned that first flight. Reality is thin, guilt is heavy, and someone always has to pay the toll. The only question is, who holds the device when the selection comes? I held it for 7 years. Now I'm just waiting for it to point at me. If you made it this far, you're a real one. Show some love with a like and subscribe for more content like this.